ready to start? Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for today's session. My name is Marwa Gumrawi, your moderator. The webinar is hosted by the Washington Center for Yemeni Study, whose vision is to be one of the main sources and references for researchers and those interested in Yemeni affairs to provide wider support for the democratic process. And the center is also committed to produce highly professional and impartial studies and reports, and shares them with the specialists in Yemeni affairs in various aspects, political, humanitarian, and cultural. Today, we are presenting the political thought of Yemen's Houthi movement, the latest study published by the center. We'll be digging deeper to form an understanding of the consequences and implications of the previous US administration designating the Houthis as a foreign terrorist group and the aspirations for what the Biden administration will do. I would like to welcome our speakers, Ms. Afrac Al-Akhali, Colonel David Roches, Mr. Norman ROULE, and Dr. Adil Dashila. Thank you for taking the time and being here with us today. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. Today's session will be entirely in English. However, we will provide you with links in the chat to the study in Arabic and in English. We will also email all participants a report summarizing this webinar in both languages. Please note the study and the webinar's report will be available on our website, WCYSUS.org. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat or in the comment section on Facebook, and we will have them answered during our Q&A session. And now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our first speaker, Ms. Afrac Al-Akhali. Ms. Afrac is a human rights journalist and board member of the Washington Center for Yemeni Studies and former general director of the youth department at the Ministry of Human Rights. Afrac is the foreign relations officer at the Abductees Mothers Association. She has a bachelor's in international relations and a master's in political science. Ms. Afrac.
Yeah, marhaba. Thank you, Marwa, and thanks and appreciate everyone attending this event today. And thank you for Washington Center for Yemeni Studies for having me. In my short time, I would like focus in the humanitarian side, and I will speak as researcher and Yemeni citizen. The Houthis are trying to plead with the international community that are an embarrassed minority. They have long succeeded in convincing some of Western human rights organizations and regimes, but the reality is that the Houthis movement is an armed and religious group. It wants to rule Yemen by force. You can imagine their slogan, it's deed. This movement is not readiness for peaceful and stability with Yemenis, and believes that it is has defined rights of preference. So I would like to briefly mention numbers that most important violation of human rights by Houthis from 20,000 to 2014 to 2020. Like Wolfley, like those who refuse their directives and the siege of many cities and prevent the entry of food and medicine. Also the bombing of the homes of those who are against them and kidnapped and tortured them to death. So the first access targeting civilians, number one, the kill, children, 464 women, 5, Omar, you can mention the numbers if you like. And women's 464, the children, and women 554, and the men 6,510. The total 7,428. Number two, injuries, children 1,114, women 940, men 16,696. And number three, the kidnapped, children 106, and human rights activists 3,511, and media professional 108, and other 3,863, the total 7,320. And number 4, access of torture to death 177. And number 4, enforced disappearance 1,910. And number 5, the displaced 3,700,000 inside in Yemen and 300,000 outside in Yemen. And the second, access control of governmental and private places. Like number 1, the health facilities 203, and the education facilities 699, and place of worship 496. And the third, access humanitarian aid. The UN says the Houthis have taken control of more than half the humanitarian organization projects in Yemen. So now for more details and information, it will be in the discussion time. And also you can visit the website and read the report. Thank you, Marwa, and thank you for all for listening.
Thank you, Afrah Al-Akhali, for being with us today. And now we would like to turn it over to Dr. Adel Deshila, our next presenter. Dr. Adel is a Yemeni writer, lecturer, and academic researcher with a PhD in English literature. He has published many research papers and political articles in Arabic and English. He also has a strong presence on Arabic channels as a Yemeni researcher. Dr. Adel?
Yes. Are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. I would like to thank the Washington Center, and I would like to thank all of you. As a Yemeni researcher, I have written this research paper with my friend or classmate, Afrah Al-Akhali. This research paper is trying to explain the political thoughts of the Houthi movement. So maybe international community thinks that the problem in Yemen is a humanitarian problem. No, it's not a humanitarian problem or issue. It's a political and ideological problem. So if we want to understand what is happening in Yemen, we have to address the root of the problem. So who are Houthis? And what is the political thought of the Houthi movement? I will try to answer these questions in this research paper. See, the Houthi militias and its religious political thought is a complex problem that requires exploring ideological, political, historical, and military elements. So the Houthis, or the religious and political thoughts of the Houthi movement, we can say that this movement who belong to the Hashemite claim that they are the most deserving of ruling Yemen because they are belonging to the Ahl al-Bayt, which means the family of our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So at the same time, the leaders of this movement believe that they must rule Yemen because they have, a theocratic theory. And I still remember when I studied my master degree, small phrase, in Animal Farm by George Orwell, when he says all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. See, Houthis believe in a theocratic state, and this is the problem. And they use violence and terrorism or as means to impose their ideology to rule Yemen and to rule Yemen as well. So at the same time, they believe that Yemenis have no choice but to accept the authority of the Imam, and that the Imam has an absolute right to conduct matters. This means that there should not be a democratic election and political parties. Yemenis must follow the Imam as he represents the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Hussein al-Houthi himself, the founder of this radical movement, rejects political participation and pluralism. So the political ideology of this movement caused Yemeni people to reject it because it deprives Yemenis of their political and civil rights. So what's the problem now with Houthis? We have to understand the issue well. We have to address the role of the root of the problem. Houthis participated in a national dialogue conference in 2014. After that, they didn't accept to participate, and they destroyed our country, Yemen. And you know what had happened in 2014? Yes, they arrested our president. We have seen this images of destruction, violence, and terrorism at the same time. So the Houthi political philosophy divides people on ethnic grounds, so that the Hashemite sect members have priority to government, while the members of the Yemeni society from other classes have nothing to do but obey the Houthi Imam. Moreover, the political ideology contradicts the basic principles of human rights. The Yemeni civil political parties ask the following questions. How can political partnership with the Houthi movement be possible? While it claims, the Houthi movement, that it is more entitled to rule. Nobody has the right to ask or to discuss the issue of the rule. And at the same time, just I will mention some manifestations of ethnic discriminations and the Houthi movement. The Hashemite class named themselves as Sayyid, as Muzaffar. What about others? They are slaves, and they must obey the Hashemite class. At the same time, a non-Hashemite, a non-Hashemite cannot marry a Hashemite lady. On the other hand, they have imposed khumus, which means 90% of Yemen's income will be collected for what the movement called Hashemite families. So today we live in the 21st century, and there are human values that we share. Unfortunately, Houthis, as a radical movement and a terrorist group, Houthis try to impose their culture, ideology by force, violence, and terrorism. Hundreds of thousands of Yemenis now outside of their cities, and I'm one of them, and I know the religious ideology of the Houthi movement well. See, now I want to just to mention small or simple ideas. Houthis are trying to market themselves to the West that they are against terrorist groups. And at the same time, they raise slogans, death to America, death to Israel, and so on. So how can we understand this ideology? Houthis says death to America and they are killing Yemenis. They are killing innocent people. They didn't accept political parties. And they said, we are a minority. Yemenis oppressed us. No. Yes, you are a minority group, and you are trying to impose your ideology on Yemenis by force and by using violence or violence. So I will come to the conclusion of this presentation. I will mention just some points. Number one, the leaders of Houthi movement consider themselves as persecuted if they not empowered. And if they are empowered, they must be obeyed. This is illegal. So the disputes between Yemenis and the Houthi movement are not completely political as some imagines. Today, some of the Western governments try to say or try to impose peace with these militias. Okay, how can we achieve peace? At the same time, these militias will not hand over weapons, and it will use weapons to impose its, ideology and political thoughts on Yemenis by violence and terrorism. Thus, it becomes clear that the Houthi movement, like any theocratic group, we have read about apartheid in South Africa. We have read about Indian system caste in India. We have studied racism in the United States of America. We live in a democratic country. That means if the Houthi wants to rule Yemen, they have to establish a political party and they have to participate in a democratic election. Then, if the people choose them, they can rule us, no problem. Unfortunately, they know that Yemenis will not select them or will not elect them to rule Yemen. So, violence is a part of the ideology of the Houthi movement. Violence and terrorism. The leader of the Houthi movement is like Joseph Kony in Africa, like Taylor in Liberia. Yemenis need peace, stability, and security. And this will not happen without removing Houthis from power. Therefore, if international resolutions related to the conflict in Yemen are not implemented, this will weaken Yemen and help spread corruption and harm the Yemeni citizens. We hope that international community will side with Yemenis against these militias. These militias will not accept peace, will not accept negotiation, will not accept political participation. This is a radical, terrorist, and ideological group. So there is no difference between the movement of Al-Houthi and racist group in Africa or any other countries. So thank you so much. And if you have any question about this paper, I'm ready to answer. Now I think that we don't have enough time. I have to end my presentation. Once again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Adil. And as a reminder to everybody, please send your questions in the chat or in the comment section on Facebook, and we will have them answered during our Q&A session. Now I would like to welcome former senior U.S. intelligence official, Mr. Norman ROULE. Mr. ROULE served for 34 years in the Central Intelligence Agency, managing numerous programs relating to Iran and the Middle East. He served as the National Intelligence Manager for Iran at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Mr. ROULE's service in the CIA's Directorate of Operations included roles as Division Chief, Deputy Division Chief, and Chief of Station. He has held multiple senior assignments in Washington, as well as during his 15 years working overseas. Mr. ROULE currently serves as a senior advisor to the Counter-Extremism Project and United Against Nuclear Iran. Welcome, Mr. ROULE.
Good morning, and thank you. And I'd like to begin by stating the Washington Center for Yemeni Studies is an important organization. Its products are quite valuable, as we've seen with its latest contribution. And I urge all those watching today to look to its website for all of the good information there. I'd also like to thank you for including me with such an important group of panelists today. I'd like to begin by discussing really three things: Iran's relationship with the Houthis and how it's impacted their role in Yemen, how Western narratives have shaped the international response to the Iran-Houthi relationship, and where I see this going. Senior Houthi leaders first engaged the Islamic Republic of Iran within a few days of the 1979 revolution, but that relationship remained very modest and was generally handled by Iran's intelligence services and even its foreign ministry until about 2011. But the popular narrative that you often see in social media is that it was the Saudi intervention in the Yemen conflict which provoked Iran to engage more with the Houthis. That would be at least partially or largely incorrect. Following the 2011 so-called Arab Spring, the Iranian government attempted to undertake a series of destabilizing activities throughout the Middle East, attempting to seize on the opportunity it thought it faced, and it placed, as we have seen in history, the Quds Force as the leading actor for its foreign policy. In general, Iran failed in much of the Middle East, but it succeeded in Yemen because there were four conditions that are required for Iran's Quds Force operations to succeed overseas. First, there was a fragile state that was enduring internecine violence. There was the capability of a logistics pipeline to provide personnel, money, training, and weapons in both directions to move people back and forth from Yemen. There was the absence of a strong international actor in the country of Yemen willing to push back on Iran. And finally, Iran had in the Houthis a violent segment, a small segment of Yemen's population that was willing to accept a partnership with the Quds Force and Lebanese Hezbollah, which Iran brought into Yemen for linguistic purposes and to replicate in some ways what Lebanese Hezbollah had undertaken in Iraq. The Houthis welcomed Iranian and Lebanese Hezbollah assistance. This included, as I mentioned, funding, training in Iran, which I think is as important, perhaps in some ways more important than training that was conducted in Yemen, because it could be conducted more intensely and to assist on issues ranging from missiles to arms work. Iran did send a small but highly impactful presence of Quds Force and Lebanese Hezbollah personnel to Yemen itself. The contribution and the role of Iran in the Yemen conflict has been unique as compared to other conflicts. In Syria, for example, Iran plays a large role in ground activities, missile activities, a variety of activities. But in Yemen, it appears that Iran's primary role has been in the provision of specialized training and equipment on armed drones, missiles, ballistic missiles, explosive boats, perhaps mines. And this narrow focus, nonetheless, has dramatically changed the conflict, extended the violence, and significantly increased the suffering of the Yemeni people. We have seen recently such advanced material as the Quds II missile, which was used to attempt to strike an Aramco facility near Jeddah. But we should also not forget that it was an Iranian armed drone that was used to kill the head of Yemen's military intelligence and attempted to kill many others and wounded many others in January 2019 at a military ceremony at El Anad Air Base near Aden. Iran has paid no international price for its role in Yemen. And this is astonishing in that it has exacerbated the conflict to such a large degree. There have been multiple UN efforts to understand Iran's weapon shipments. Moscow has generally blocked, delayed, or complicated these efforts from the United Nations. So although there is a vast amount of evidence that Iran has undertaken this malign activity, it has violated multiple UN resolutions. It has paid no price for this. And I believe that lack of international focus has encouraged Iran to believe that its work in Yemen has simply not touched a red line for the international community. Western narratives on Iran's presence are complicated and often include an anti-Saudi or an anti-Arab bias, or they're often based on a lack of understanding by commentators of Yemen's political issues. And there are also genuine humanitarian concerns. But when you put these three together, you end up with a situation that certainly favors Iran, favors the Houthis, favors a paralysis of significant international military options that would push back against the Houthis, in part because of the political and social costs of the Iraq and Afghan war experiences for the United States and other partners who were in those conflicts. Western countries are generally focused solely on providing significant humanitarian aid to Yemen, which the Houthis are able to control, to hold hostage, to threaten to cut off. And for this reason, in some ways, the humanitarian effort in Yemen has become one of the greatest shields of the Houthis. But at the same time, we in the international community have shown little interest in devoting the military or diplomatic resources to push Iran back or to constrain its proxy. And this is similar to how Iran has operated in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. I think the problem is that you will often hear that the US is seeking to leave the forever wars, but missing from that statement is that the wars do not end with our departure and the suffering of people continue. I've often stated that those people who suggest that the Houthis should be allowed to dominate Yemen usually don't have their families at risk of living in a Houthi-dominated environment. So they have some freedom of being so far away. So where does all this go? Well, certainly Iran is not the sole driver of the Yemen conflict, but Quds Force actions, again, tolerated by the international community, will continue to exacerbate and extend the conflict. There's little likelihood that the current direction of the conflict will change in regards to Iran and the Quds Force. Iran's interest in Yemen certainly are to threaten and bog down at a very limited cost its rival Saudi Arabia. But we should not ignore that Yemen has a hugely strategic geographic position. Its presence at the south of the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandab give it an enormous influence over a large percentage of global trade. I think something more than 10% of the world's rice moves through the Red Sea. More than 4 million barrels of oil a day move through the Red Sea, as well as the economic development of the northern Red Sea basin. There is no reason to believe that Iran will withdraw from this conflict. There was no reason to believe that the Quds Force feels compelled to withdraw from this conflict. There are many reasons to believe that Iran's goal will be to create a Lebanon-like situation where international aid is used to sustain a broad government infrastructure, whereas it maintains control of key security institutions, patronage institutions, and of course the militia of the Houthis to restrain other actors. Iran will also likely seek to cement its influence in Yemen through some sort of international conference. We saw this happen in Syria. This was not a helpful experience because Javad Zarif used the conference and diplomatic engagement to, in essence, buy time for the Quds Force on the ground. The United States and the European Union will likely avoid direct involvement, but will probably call for more multilateral diplomatic efforts, similar to the work done by Martin Griffiths. Humanitarian concerns will continue. Many of them are valid, but the Houthis will continue to use these as a shield for military pressure. One final comment. Historically, And in the popular social media, Houthis are considered local actors responding to local issues. I think there's reason to believe this is changing, and this will make the conflict more difficult to resolve. For 2 years, the Houthis have rejected multiple United Nations diplomatic efforts. The Saudis have undertaken some intense diplomacy, which receives very little press, and the Houthis have rejected this diplomatic outreach. We now see that Iran has assigned an IRGC officer as its ambassador in Sanaa, just as the IRGC has done in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. A Houthi ambassador is now in Damascus. We now see a growing sense that the Houthis are becoming part of Iran's axis of resistance. The similarities between the Houthi and the Hezbollah flags are often noted. And you recently have seen even the Houthis displaying an interest in playing other regional politics when they offered to free Saudi captives in exchange for the release of Hamas prisoners. Finally, we have seen that recent press reports that the Israelis have placed air defense missiles at Eilat to defend against potential Houthi attacks. And I believe this is the first Yemeni threat that Israel has responded to, perhaps since the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine used Yemeni territory to threaten Israeli shipping in the early 70s. I believe, in closing, the pressure will grow among the West to involve the Houthis in a political settlement that will likely leave them with a disproportionate share of power unless the current trend is reversed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. ROULE. And now I would like to invite our last but not least speaker today, Colonel David DeRoche. Colonel DeRoche is an associate professor at the Near East South Asia Center for Security Studies. Prior to this, he was the director responsible for defense policy concerning Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates and Yemen. Prior to this assignment, he has served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense as the liaison to the Department of Homeland Security, as the Senior Country Director for Pakistan, and as the NATO Operations Director, and as the Deputy Director for Peacekeeping. An airborne ranger in the Army Reserve, he was awarded the Bronze Star for service in Afghanistan. He has commanded conventional and special operations parachute units and has served on the U.S. Special Operations Command staff as well as the Joint Staff. Thank you, Colonel DeRoche, for being here with us today. Go ahead.
I have to point out two things. First, I don't speak for the U.S. government. And secondly, I only refer to myself as colonel when I'm speaking to a lieutenant colonel who's given me a hard time. So give me a moment here and I will get my screen going. There we go. 3, 2, 1. I do have slides. I'm going to speak narrowly to the issue of sanctions and the problems of sanctions as we find them. And I'm going to be drawing primarily on my experience working on sanctions in the White House Drug Czar's office in the Clinton administration, as well as my observations in the Middle East. Basically, this is my contact information. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, I post things like the UN panel of experts reports as they come out. So you might find that interesting. First off, of course, we're all aware of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. It is one of the great, probably one of the two greatest ongoing famine situations. And it's awful. The question is, you can argue over who caused it. You can argue over who benefits from it, but it certainly complicates decision-making and the issue of sanctions. Sanctions became, under Donald Trump, the preferred means for the United States to expand its economic power, to actually exercise it. I'd argue that this has been a dormant tool of national policy, that the potential of it has not been fully realized. But obviously, the argument when any entity, and particularly the broad sanctioning of the entire Houthi movement, was undertaken in the dying days of the Trump administration, the counter argument is that it will exacerbate the humanitarian situation. Obviously, the administration is aware of that, and the fact that there were, an unprecedented number of licenses and exceptions awarded with the sanction designation 5 licenses, I think illustrates that at least there was an attempt to try to mitigate this, but the Biden administration is reviewing these sanctions as it should, and I think there will be attempts to fine tune this, and that's primarily because of the humanitarian impact. Of course, the Saudi-led coalition, which includes significant components from the UAE, although they've stepped back and have operated at a distance, and of course, when you get to the south, they're at opposites with that, has been criticized for its conduct of the war, primarily operating from the air. Mass numbers of civilian casualties, as you see here, some of whom were hit under circumstances that certainly warrant investigation by the authorities from the air. And of course, there have been calls for international supervision or punishment of this. As our first speaker noted, there's also been crimes committed by the Houthis. It remains unclear whether there will ever be an accurate or adequate calling to account. As Norman noted, there just hasn't been the focus on this, particularly on the Houthis. The Saudis and the Saudi-led coalition, at least Western public opinion, does seem to be mobilized on this, and we've seen issues to restrict weapons sales, in the Western democracies, for example. Of course, the Houthis remain a potent force, and a force who, at least in terms of their ideology, is hostile to Western interests. So, of course, you can see the placards in the back, Allahu Akbar, death to America, death to Israel, et cetera, et cetera. I think that there's a strong case to be made that at least at some point, when a political movement says something, we should believe what they say, particularly if it involves the threat of violence. I know that people tend to denigrate this and say, well, this is just boilerplate. This is not to be taken literally. But I think, I have seen numerous occasions where, we've played this argument where elites in a foreign country have told us, well, don't pay any attention to this. This is just for domestic consumption. We don't really mean this. At the end of the day, we'll come to an agreement. But what we find is that, a lot of times, the rhetoric boxes the actor into a corner. And after weeks or months of this assurance that this is just for domestic consumption, it doesn't really mean anything, they come back and say, we're unable to, carry through commitments we've made to you because, quite frankly, our rhetoric has painted us into a corner. So I think that, the Houthis should be dealt with as a hostile force, as a force that's hostile to really global interests. And those global interests are maintenance of freedom of navigation, the mitigation of humanitarian tragedy in Yemen. And of course, the Houthis, again, have launched attacks into the interior of Saudi Arabia, which has the effect of destabilizing the entire global market in energy, as well as the development of Saudi Arabia using Iranian produced missiles. So here you see the Qiyam missile, which is a triumph of Iranian engineering, painted, cut in half, shipped in a shipping container to Yemen, welded back together, and then fired into the Iranian or into the Saudi heartland as the Burhan missile. Of course, last week, the UN panel of experts noted, and this is a screen capture from the report, that the Houthis have been diverting Yemeni government funds at least $1.8 billion, taking $4.23 million worth of public money and transferring that to traders, 48% of that to one specific group. These seem to me to be indicative of bad faith, to be indicative of profiting off the humanitarian crisis, siphoning off aid, using it to award favored partners and to direct an outcome that is positive for the Houthis but bad for the Yemenis, and seems to call for some sort of sanctions. The argument here is now one of efficacy. I would argue that sanctions against individuals, such as the Hayil al-Sayed Anam group, those are certainly called for, and those can be conducted without impeding the humanitarian effort in Yemen. When you get to the broader issue, though, I think that there is a school of thought that says, well, some diversion, siphoning, however illegal, however abhorrent it is just the cost of doing business in an area where there is a humanitarian crisis. So that's really an argument over efficacy of sanctions. And it's an argument which will go on, and it's an argument in which, you know, there's a lot of suffering and a lot of emotion, as there should be. Not talked about as often, the issue of this floating, deteriorating oil tanker, the FSO Saphir, which is off the port of Hodeidah, which holds about 48 million gallons of oil, which is at risk of deteriorating. The UN has been trying to get aboard it to conduct studies, to find ways to remove the cargo, and then to dismantle the ship so that it doesn't break up and become an ecological damage, you know, in the Red Sea, which is, you know, a fragile ecosystem and doesn't have access to broad ocean currents to dissipate an oil spill. Yesterday, the New York Times reported that the Houthi government refused to provide assurances that the mission wouldn't be interfered with, which means that the cost of doing this is prohibitive. So what we're seeing, you know, it's unclear whether this is deliberate policy to draw attention to Yemen, whether this is local leaders who are trying to wet their beaks and get a broader taste of something, or whether this is just simply ignorance. But there seems to be a high sort of inverse tragedy of the commons combined with a game of chicken, in which the Houthi authorities don't seem to care as much about removing this as the international authorities do, and that in itself, you know, risks a pretty large regional ecological damage, and again is probably worthy of some form of punishment, if, you know, to include sanctions, if only for the deterrent effect against further despoiling of the commons scenarios. Now, as I said, sanctions, you know, are generally unpopular, particularly when, you know, they're a blunt instrument. And when you're dealing with a corrupt organization, as our second speaker pointed out, then that corrupt organization manages to mitigate the impact of sanctions on them, spreads the damage of the sanctions upon the general population, which in effect is held hostage. And quite frankly, the corrupt rulers manage to receive a larger part of a shrinking pie. So a school of argument says that this is immoral because of the humanitarian damage, that we should just put up with this as cause of doing business. But I would point out that during the apartheid era, you know, people did demand sanctions against the apartheid regime, even though there was a recognition that the impact of these sanctions were disproportionately felt among the, as it were, hostage audience, in this instance, the Black population of South Africa under apartheid. So there is precedent for doing this. The question really becomes less of a moral one and more of how to mitigate the impact of that sanctions. Now, I would argue that sanctions in recent years, you know, sanctions have always been a blunt instrument. You see a blunt instrument here, but the aim of policymakers is to reduce it to a scalpel-like precision. And with the increase in the use of financial intelligence, the use of computer-assisted things, that sanctions are now much capable of being much more directly targeted, particularly against individuals, than they were when I was working on this issue with drug trafficking organizations in the 1990s. There still, however, is an aspect of that bluntness. There's a need to refine them, to go on constantly. I think that most people will view the individual sanctions against identified bad actors within the Houthi hierarchy, people who have diverted funds, profited off of it, to allow them to not spend the benefits of their to convert the benefits of raking off these things into a London townhouse. That's a good thing. But again, it will be an open argument that will go on for a while, and quite frankly, will have more of a political than a moral asset to it, although these political arguments will be expressed in terms of moral imperatives as to whether sanctioning the entire Houthi movement itself is effective or whether it's counterproductive. So I've gone very quickly through some complex issues here. I want to save maximum time for questions. Again, I emphasize I don't speak for the United States government, but I hope you found this to be provocative and welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel DeRoche. And right now we will be moving on to our Q&A session. We have a lot of questions coming in for all of our speakers. I would like to start with Mr. Norman. We have a few questions for you here. The first one, We would like to know from you how the designation of the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization will affect the peace process. And do you think the Biden administration may abolish this decision? And what will be the implications of that on what's going on in Yemen?
Certainly, many commentators have stated that the designation by the Trump administration of the Houthis will complicate the peace process. This is one of those issues where I'm not sure the peace process can become actually more complicated. What a designation risks doing, and again, this is not an invalid concern by some people, is that it may make it difficult for banks to move money for aid groups. That's the concern by humanitarians, but with humanitarian organizations. But regarding the peace process itself, I don't think that this is something that challenges the process, because the Houthis in essence have a diplomatic arrangement that the Arab coalition and the Saudis have offered. Martin Griffiths from the United Nations has been there many times and engaged with them. The idea that Houthi leaders who were sanctioned at that time would not engage never really came up. So I think there's a political process aspect to this, and that is that the Houthis do not feel that they have the best deal they can receive politically at present, and therefore will extend the conflict. And then there's a humanitarian aspect, and it is conceivable that designation would complicate the movement of funds and resources to Houthi entities, given that so much of the humanitarian effort is under the domination of the Houthis, given their control of the territory. Thank you.
And just to kind of go off of that, do you think, or do you see that the Trump administration has helped the Houthis take over in Yemen, or created chaos in the region, from weapon sales to, trying to achieve like some more benefits by designating them as a terrorist group?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but if your comment is that the new administration or the Trump administration exacerbated the situation,
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe so. The Trump administration worked extensively. And when I mean the Trump administration, I'm primarily talking about our military assets in the region, working to interdict weapon shipments from Iran and weapon shipments to and from East Africa, from Yemen. And then, of course, our diplomats on the ground. And there were some exceptional officers in our foreign service, to include now Ambassador to Iraq, Matt Tuller, one of the finest officers in the American Foreign Service. So there was no lack of diplomatic or military work, doing all of the right things on the ground. But it's a very difficult weapon shipment arena to interdict. The amount of the scope of the geography is huge, as we've seen from the Iranian weapons that have made it in, as well as Iran's ability to bring Houthis to Iran itself for training on how they can construct their own weapons inside of Yemen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My next couple of questions are for Mr. Roches. Can we get an overview of the areas that are being who's controlling what in Yemen currently, do you believe there's any possibility of establishing a broad-based government in Yemen that is inclusive and represents everyone's aspirations in their country?
Well, I think that perhaps our Yemeni participants would be better placed to decide who controls what, to describe that. But I would point out that in broad terms, the Houthis, who are from the north, from Sanaa, they managed to take control of Sanaa in 2014, primarily through the treachery of Ali Abdullah Saleh. They control the national capital. They control the main port, Hodeidah, and almost everything that goes in and out of the country either goes through Hodeidah or goes through Aden. Of course, there's smaller points, Mukalla, places like that, Mocha. But, the main container port is at Hodeidah. So that's really what's important here. If you're going to do a distribution of humanitarian supplies, you have to do it on the established network. And Yemen That was Hadeda to Sanaa and then radiating outwards into the interior. So, they, to the extent that they do that, they have a control. They have a higher level of influence. Now, in terms of establishing a broader basis government, the problem is to do that. And a sort of Ambrose Bierce Devil's Dictionary definition of diplomacy is coming up with a solution in which everybody sacrifices justice for the sake of expediency. I'm not sure that we're ready at that point yet. I mean, the Houthis control more of the government than their numbers, than any democratic principle would admit to. They've conquered it by force of arms in contravention of United Nations resolutions and in contravention of the established internationally recognized government. So if there is to be a true, democratic broad-based government, it would have to it would require for the Houthis to achieve a level of power and influence that their numbers support, which is a fraction of what they have now. I don't see them agreeing to that. Then you have the complicating issue of, a semi, the South is becoming more like the Kurdish regional government in Iraq than it is becoming what it was before 2014. So I honestly am not sanguine on the situation getting resolved on those lines anytime soon.
Thank you. Do you think that there will be precautions taken, or is it possible to have precautions taken by the US government to avoid further humanitarian suffering when classifying al-Houthis as a terrorist group? Yes,
yeah,
for you.
Yeah, I think there's a huge effort to do that, but the question is discerning intent from result. And how well can this be done? So there are some people who, when faced with regulation, try to make a good faith attempt to conform with that regulation and say, okay, let's try and do this. There are others who, quite frankly, will say, oh, I can't do this. This regulation is too onerous and therefore we won't be able to do it. I don't think any of the humanitarian community currently involved in Yemen fall into that latter category. I think they operate in good faith under very difficult circumstances. But, just understand that, any impediment in aid now has a convenient outside source. So if anything goes wrong, they say, well, this is all because of sanctions. And there will be a sympathetic audience for that argument. So it's going to require a lot of strength, and belief to carry on sanctions when these stories start to trickle out. And quite frankly, I don't think the United States administration views Yemen as that important a scenario. And given the congressional opposition to the war in Yemen, which the narrative, rightly or wrongly, is that this was something started by Saudi Arabia and its partners and has led to a humanitarian disaster for which Saudi Arabia and its partners are overwhelmingly responsible. I don't see an attempt to. I think that the visual image of starving children will overwhelm those issues of state to the detriment even of American national security interests. I'm sorry, that's not very sanguine.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Roche. Mr. ROULE, I do have a question for you here. Do you see that the Western governments are aware of the threat of the Houthis taking control in the region, and its implications on the region, and then from there, if the Biden administration decides to stop the weapons sale as they have been saying, what will be the implications of that on the region and in Yemen and the humanitarian crisis that are occurring at the moment?
Certainly, there is a deep understanding by multiple Western powers of the nature of Iran's involvement in Yemen and the nature of the Houthi activity and personalities in Yemen. I have met no officials that are not fully aware of all of the facts. The question becomes how they want to resolve the situation. And this often turns into something similar to how many people view Iran or Lebanese Hezbollah. Certainly, we wish they weren't there, but in order to push them back, it would require great humanitarian suffering. So we've got to find a way to engage with them. I think that's where you tend to see a movement among many international players. There was certainly an understanding of what the Houthis can do on the Bab el-Mandab and the lower Red Sea. Indeed, during the Obama administration, there were reports of missile firings against 2 U.S. naval vessels, and we responded with attacks on Houthi radar and missile sites in Yemen itself. So there's no lack of understanding per se. As to where this goes forward from here, as I say, I really do think you're going to see a sense that we'd have to find a way to deal with them and hope that good governance over time pushes them out of power. That's how people respond to Iraq. That's how people are now looking at Syria. And it's how people have responded to Lebanon. Thank you. Thank
you. I have a question here for Dr. Adel. Dr. Adel, what are these, we have some of our audience are asking, what are the sources of authority that Houthis are using to justify their ideology as practices? Dr. Adel?
I'm not sure if he's with us. He keeps coming on.
You've muted him.
Oh,
he's muted, so the moderator has to unmute him. Here we go. I'll try and unmute him. Whoops.
Oh, no, there he is. Okay. I got him. All right, Mr. Adel.
Okay. I would like to emphasize that as a Yemeni researcher and as a son of Yemen, and I know the Houthis movement well, and the sources or references of this culture, ideology, political thoughts. You can read the handouts or small papers by Abdelbaye Hussein al-Houthi, the founder of himself, or the founder of this movement, sorry. And you will find in details the ideology of this movement. They believe that they must rule Yemenis, and Yemenis don't have any choice except to obey them. This is number one. Number two, you can read the culture of the Zaydi sect as a branch of Shia. You can read the books of Abdullah ibn Hamza. You can read the books of Majd al-Din al-Mu'ayyadi. And you can read the books of Badr al-Din al-Houthi, the father of Hussein al-Houthi, and Abdul Malik al-Houthi. I have mentioned in this research paper many references in Arabic, and I have translated them into English. So maybe you can ask me, what is the difference between Houthis and other groups? Okay, Houthis are not a political party. And in 1993, Hussein al-Houthi and his brother Yahya al-Houthi participated in a democratic election. And they were members of the representative of and the parliament, the Yemeni parliament. Then they established small party, Hezbollah, as a religious party. Nobody elected them. So this radical group is like racist group in Africa, terrorist groups in the world. See, for example, what had happened in America before 1 month, I think that, or last month, when protesters attacked Capitol. And we have seen how the American authority deals with these protesters. Houthis destroyed everything now. Now we have, for example, we have international resolution number 2216. Houthis didn't accept political solution. They didn't accept negotiation, peace. They say we are defending Yemenis, and at the same time, they are killing Yemenis. So their actions on the ground show their ideological culture and violence and terrorism or terrorist acts. If you want to read the ideology or political thoughts of this movement, you can read their references in Arabic. Unfortunately, some of these books are not translated into English. So you will find some difficulties. You have to read their books, and you will find the problem well. Now the problem with Yemen, with the Houthis, is not a political problem. So we need Houthis to come and to discuss social, political issues on the table. And now we can share them, no problem. But Houthis didn't accept. Abdul Malik al-Houthi himself thinks that he represents Allah and the Prophet of Muhammad, peace be upon him. Okay, how can we deal with him? How can we make a political process with these groups? No, because, and at the same time, they are using violence. You know what had happened in Amran and Taiz and Sanaa, and how they destroyed the houses of their opposition. Like tribal sheikhs. They have destroyed religious centers, political headquarters. And they have destroyed everything now. And they didn't accept us. So we have to address the root of the problem. If the international community, Europeans, Americans, want to implement peace in Yemen, they have to side with Yemenis. They have to side with Yemeni people to end the military coup in Sanaa by force or by other means. Otherwise, we will see a lot of radical groups. We will see Al-Qaeda, we will see ISIS, we will see other radical groups in Yemen. So how now, for example, now the Martin Griffith himself didn't achieve political solution, or he cannot discuss with these militias the Yemeni problems well. They all the time they are saying we are against Saudis, we are against Americans, we are against Israel, and at the same time we are killing us. Please try to read the history of the Hashemite class, and you will find the ideology of this movement well. Just I would like to tell you just one thing. My grandfather told me that in the past, if he wants to shake the hand of Imam, that Imam, he will take, piece of cotton and he will cover his hand, and then he will, shake the hand of tribal man. This is a radical group, religious group. We cannot, share them or live under the control of these militias. Most of Yemenis live abroad, and you know that well today. Okay, if the Houthi, for example, now wants to solve those problems, no need to go to international community. We have to stay with each other. We have to discuss our problems by ourselves. They will not accept. So you can go to Google and you will find a lot of research papers, references, books, talk about the ideology of this radical movement. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Adel. Mr. Norman, we have a bunch of attendees who are asking for more clarification on the impact of designating the group as a foreign terrorist organization on Yemenis. Would you please just give us a little bit more clarification on that?
That's difficult to provide a precise response because the impact will depend upon a number of factors which are variables amongst themselves. When an organization is declared a foreign terrorist organization, you see a chilling effect among international banks who not unreasonably believe any engagement with that organization will risk their financial reputation and open them to legal exposure involving fines and other financial penalties, which could damage their business. So in theory, designating the Houthis as a terrorist organization could cause some banks to say they'd rather not deal with humanitarian issues because they don't want problems down the line. That's something that is often discussed on Iran itself. The United States government cannot force banks and intermediaries to engage on these issues. The United States government has actually very little influence over these companies, which is something most people tend to miss when they think about the sanctions issues. When it comes to providing waivers, in theory, the United States government and other governments routinely can provide waivers to allow banks to engage in this activities to support specific transfers of humanitarian aid and assistance. This depends on a couple of factors. How fast does the US government work? How clear is the case? They've got to have a bank involved, and it can become complicated. The narrative that is in the public is usually that such waivers are too few, too slow, not being applied. And for this reason, governments tend to say we will only sanction the leadership of an organization, vice in some ways an organization itself, particularly if it's a governing entity. The problem with that is these individuals often have very little money in bank accounts abroad or financial assets to actually constrain. So the sanctions don't really have much impact on them because they use intermediaries to enrich themselves. I don't think I'm giving a very satisfying answer to your question, but I think it's the one we often apply on Iran. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's very thorough. I do have a final question. It's a kind of a two-part question for both Mr. Roches and Mr. ROULE. You can choose which part to answer to. The question says, what's the best way to deal with the Houthis if they refuse to engage in any meaningful peace resolution like they have been for the past 6 years? Do you think that they would even engage in a process that doesn't give them power over the north? And in that scenario, what should be the solution to achieve peace in Yemen if groups like Houthi refuse to come to the table? Should the Yemenis just accept the status quo? Mr. Roches, we can start with you first.
That's a tough question. I think that the first answer is one of the things I've noted, and I do applaud the expansion of individual sanctions. I've noted that there's a large number of indigenous revolutionary movements throughout, what we used to call the developing world or the third world, that their children all wind up going to Oxford or Harvard. And I think that, extending individual sanctions on leaders and their children, more to the point, forcing them to make, that has the effect of moderating influence. We've all seen the pictures of the son of a IRGC lieutenant general in Spain with sports cars and all that. So I think everybody wants a better life for their children, and I think that's one way to do it. But then in the other line, I think, quite frankly, there has to be, a military solution, unfortunately, may be required at least in the area of Hodeidah. And I think that you won't get a situation that reflects anything close to democratic ideals or doesn't reward, basically, the taking over the Yemeni government as long as there is that port in the hands of that one movement. And that's not a very sanguine answer. It's an answer of despair. But I think it's clear to me that the capacity for suffering in Yemen is more than anybody could have predicted 4 years ago. The inefficacy of the measures that have tried before have proven themselves. So I don't really have a good answer.
Thank you, Mr. Roches. Mr. ROULE, would you like to say anything?
I don't think there is an answer to that question. It's very subjective. This is a decision for the Yemeni people. This is the decision for the Yemeni government. This is something that the international community will have difficulty responding to, because no matter what military solution is proposed, as we saw during the efforts against Hodeidah, which notably the Trump administration did not support, people can respond once you cut off Hodeidah or another deep water port about 45 kilometers north. You deny most of the aid getting in a country, and you risk a catastrophic famine. Frankly, that narrative, once it hits the press, is something that tends to overwhelm military logic or security logic, and it just leaves you with a no man's land of decisions, which move very slowly in the West, because again, for most people in the West, this isn't their country and it's a long way away. I'm very sorry to say that, but I don't really think that a military solution is going to be acceptable to European or Western powers.
Thank you very much. I think that definitely gives us some perspective, at least, of what's going on, and what we should be thinking about in the upcoming administration as well. It looks like we covered all of our questions. Do any of our presenters have anything else that they want to cover before we wrap up? All right, I think that covers it all. Great, thank you everyone. We appreciate you being here. I just want to remind you again that, Mr. Durush, was that? Oh, okay. I just wanted to remind everybody that the study is available on our website, WCYSUS.org, in Arabic and in English. A report will be published to summarize today's webinar, questions and answers in Arabic and English as well. So keep a lookout for that in your emails, as well as on the website. Thanks again for joining us today, and we will see you next time. Thank you, everyone.